O homem que mata, o homem que mente.
Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar. We are going to talk today about different cultures and how they are reacting to COVID-19. Yeah. So for those who don't know us, I'm Jussara and this is Fernando. We are both Brazilians and Dutch. We have been living now for 15 years in the Netherlands, and I'm a psychologist and a pedagogue, and my career it's basically developed in as a facilitator, coach, and assessor in leadership and culture. And most recently, I have been also doing photography, which is my passion. So now I'm really working to combine both culture and photography. Can you tell a bit more about you, Fernando?
So I'm Fernando Lancer. I was an HR executive in Brazil and in the Netherlands for many years. In the past 15 years, I've been working as a consultant on leadership development and organizational culture, and living with Jussara for the past 15 years here in the Netherlands. So let's begin. Our program today is to approach 6 types of culture, 6 different strategies against COVID-19, and with a special focus on China, Italy, Brazil, the Netherlands, Germany, and the USA.
So before going directly to a model that we will work with you, we would like to say something which might be seen as obvious, but it's always important to keep in mind. So there's no culture which is better than other. Cultures are different and they are equivalent. At the same time, every culture has its own flavor, let's say, and this can be useful to one person, can be serving to one person and not serving to another one. So they're really equivalent. Also, we will talk more about common values, because although cultures are different, they can be diverse. There's also some common values that bring some cultures a bit closer to each other. So this is also part of things that we are talking today with you. Culture doesn't explain everything, so we are talking about COVID-19 and how culture impacts. Of course, impacts a lot, but it's not everything. So we have to consider history, we have to consider geography, we have to consider economy. Those things are influenced by culture and influence culture in return. And always keep in mind the individual, because the individual is influenced by culture, but people are unique. So please keep this in mind. Okay.
We work with a model that has been created by Haup Versten, one of our colleagues here in the Netherlands. And Haup talks about 6 different types of culture. His framework is based on the Hofstede studies. So basically what Haup did was he looked at the scores of different countries in the Hofstede study, and then he realized that some of those scores were similar amongst themselves. And he created these 6 categories which cluster the types of culture that have similar scores. The first type is what we call the contest culture. And this is a type of culture in which the basic assumption is that life is a competition. And in this competition, there are always 2 opposing ideas that clash against each other. And out of that clash, something positive comes out. This is typical of all the Anglo-Saxon cultures. They are all contest cultures.
Like USA, UK, New Zealand,
Australia. Yeah, these are all contest cultures. The second type of culture is what we call the well-oiled machine culture. And the basic assumption in these cultures is that life is a bit chaotic. So it needs to be structured, it needs to be organized. Society needs to organize in such a way that people can function like a well-oiled machine in society. If everybody fulfills their role within a structure and a plan, then life will be easy. This is typical of the Germanic cultures, so Germany, but also Switzerland, Austria, yeah, the Czech Republic as well. These are all well-oiled machine cultures. The third type is what we call the network culture. And in the network culture, the basic assumption is that everybody is equal. People have the same value. But each individual is pulling towards their own interests in different directions. So there needs to be some kind of consensus reached so that people can live in harmony together. And this is typical
from Netherlands
of the Dutch culture, and all the Scandinavian cultures are also network cultures. Now, these three at the top are all egalitarian cultures, so low hierarchy. The three at the bottom are high on hierarchy.
Yeah, so that's the example of the pyramid culture, where then there's a high hierarchy, very structured hierarchy. So let's say that there's a lot of respect to the boss and the decisions are top down. At the same time, group relations are of most importance, and relationships come as a strong value in those cultures. Those are typical. For example, Brazil, it's an example. Could you put? Yeah, Brazil, it's an example. All the Latin American countries, most of African countries, and Middle Eastern countries as well are in those. So a big chunk of the world is pyramid.
Social pyramid.
Social pyramid. And the solar system is another one where there's also a high hierarchy, but at the same time, individual opinions are very concerned. So people are more concerned in having their own opinion than in belonging to a group. So there's a kind of tension between obeying and respecting the hierarchy, but also doing his or her own agenda. Yeah? Those are typical for Belgium, for instance, French, Spain, and some part of Italy. The other cluster, it's how called the family cluster. The family cluster, it's very similar to the pyramid in the sense that it's also very hierarchical, but relationships are strong, important, but especially the family relationships are important. And the big difference is that in those countries, there's a very long-term orientation vision. So that's the difference from the pyramid countries. Typical from some Asian countries, like China, India, for example. Yeah?
So let's start with China, because the virus started in China. So we begin with China.
Yeah, we will talk a bit more about. So relationships, as I said before, it's in the cluster family of strong importance, as well as groups. So people belong to groups and are loyal to them and feel safe being protected by groups. Hierarchy, very strong hierarchy, but the hierarchy, it's respect the boss, respect the top-down decisions, and there are rules, but even though there are rules, the boss has the last word, so sometimes can even go against rules, but taking the decision by top.
The rules are relative.
Relative, so that's the relative.
They depend on the situation.
Yeah. So the relativism is also connected with many truths, different from some Western countries where there's this search for one truth. In China, there are many, many truths. And those are connected with the long-term perspective, because today maybe I believe in something and tomorrow I have to adapt to something else. So though China has a very flexible culture that is also aiming to the long term. So everything that I do today, I also have to think about the consequences in the long term and be connected with this. So Fernando will talk a bit more how those characteristics impact the COVID in the 19 in China.
Yeah. The one of the characteristics of the hierarchical cultures is that people hide bad news from the boss. People are very afraid of the power of the boss. So what happened in China, in Wuhan, when the virus was first identified, is that the local authorities wanted to hide the bad news from the central government. And they tried to play down the virus. They said, well, it cannot be so serious. It cannot be a real threat. They even, as you probably know, they even called the doctor who initially identified the virus. They called him in to a police department and made him retract his statements about the seriousness of the virus, because they accused him of trying to spread fear among the population. And the only reason why the bad news eventually got out was through the relationships, because there were other people in the medical community in Wuhan who had relationships with people in Beijing, and they managed to get the news across and say, look, this is really serious. The local authorities are denying it, but you need to do something. And indeed, the central government then acted in typical autocracy and sent someone as a special envoy to Wuhan. This person assessed the situation, found that indeed it was more serious than the mayor was saying, and immediately fired the mayor and most of his direct reports, and assigned a new mayor to Wuhan and new staff of assistants to that mayor. And in a week, they decided to shut down the city and close it off from the rest of the country and from the rest of the world. So they applied a customized set of rules saying that Wuhan would be completely locked down in a very draconian way, which at the time was considered to be too strict by the rest of the world. And people in the US and the UK typically said, well, this could only happen in China because it's such an autocratic government. But indeed, it was necessary, but only in China could they do it so quickly, and only in China would people obey so quickly such strict measures. There was a lot of cooperation in China as well, and that comes from the relationship-oriented culture, the collectivism. People from all over the country applied to become volunteers and go into Wuhan and help, even though they knew that once they were inside the city, they would not be allowed to leave the city until the lockdown was lifted. So many of them stayed for 3 months without being able to leave Wuhan, but still thousands of people poured in to become volunteers in the fight against the virus. And all of this, of course, was possible in China because there is also a disposition for personal sacrifice in the Chinese culture. Because of the long-term orientation, people are willing to make personal sacrifice to reach a long-term goal. And sometimes this is even something for the next generation. So people would sacrifice so that their children can have a better life or their grandchildren can have a better life. So they did this sacrifice of obeying the severe lockdown and helping as volunteers to reach the long-term goal of beating the coronavirus. The virus went from China to Italy. So what's the Italian culture like?
Yeah, so that's the solar system. You can see in the picture there. So coming back to the idea of it's a hierarchical country. At the same time, then there's this tension about respecting the hierarchy and having his or her own opinions, to obey what people want to do. So there's at the same time a top-down decision, so autocracy and disobedience, because the individual play an important role here more than groups. Another characteristic is a need for avoid uncertainty in Italy. And this need can be sometimes connected to superstition and religion, in this case in Italy, very much connected to religion. And there are two aspects that from the culture that play a role also in COVID-19. One is the bureaucracy, no need to say, it's a strong bureaucracy there. And the bella figura. The bella figura, it's more than a looking good, but it's also looking good and being gracious in the way people are seen by the society, by the eyes of the other ones.
Yeah.
So we
elegance
say,
and appearance.
yeah, also, yeah, counts a lot in the Italian culture. So we will see, Fernando will tell how those impact the COVID there.
Well, initially, there was a conflict between the central government in Italy and the local governments in the north of Italy, because the virus arrived in Italy at the height of the ski season. So all these ski resorts in the north of Italy were having the big influx of tourists coming from all over the world to ski there. And naturally, they opposed any kind of lockdown. Then they basically had an attitude of, this rule does not apply to me. You want to lock down the country, you can lock down the country, but not my village, not my resort, not my hotel. And while this was going on, the virus was spreading. It got to a point where they accepted that in some villages that they had to lock down, but only in that village then. And the village next door was not locked down. Only a week later, they also had to lock down the village next door. And so the lockdown in Italy went from village to village rather than the whole region. By the time they locked down the whole of northern Italy, the virus had spread not only within Italy, but also all over Europe, because the skiers who had been in Italy took the virus back home to them in the countries that they came from, including to Brazil. The virus went all the way to Brazil with tourists that had been in northern Italy. Now, the Italian culture is also all about religion and superstition. So initially there were a lot of miracle cures and people thinking that if they prayed, that would be enough to beat the virus. And meanwhile, it was spreading.
Nothing against praying, but yeah,
it's
science.
Not
enough. Enough. Science must be together in this case, right?
Initially, also people resisted using masks because they thought, okay, masks make me look ugly, so I'm not going to wear a mask. Now the attitude has changed, and a lot of people are wearing masks in Italy, but initially there was a resistance to that. And the bureaucracy harmed the agility of the measures that were taken. There was a lot of discussion also about whether this should be in law, it should be legislation, or a decree is enough, or should we just do recommendations? Should they be regional or local? All of this damaged the process initially and contributed to the fact that in Italy we had a real tragedy because the health system collapsed. There were not enough intensive care units to handle the people, and we had thousands of people dying because the whole system collapsed. And the virus then went to Brazil.
Yeah. We got to know today that our president in Brazil, Bolsonaro, is also with the virus. So it really got to Brazil and hard there. But talking about some characteristics of the culture, relationships are of a strong value in Brazil, as well as groups. And people try to first develop relationships, not about small talk, but it's really about developing trust. So if doing business with Brazil, take your time to get to know people and for people to get to know you, because this is really important in doing business there. It's a hierarchical country, and the magic thinking and the legislation are at service of avoiding uncertainty. Legislation is very detailed, and the magic thinking, it's really about superstition. Sometimes the Brazilians go also to 2 different religions,
Yeah, they're very
different, very different gods, but you pray sometimes for 2 different gods, 2 different religions, because then you have at your service those gods, which makes people feel safe. Some other characteristics, differently that maybe some people think, Brazilians work hard and play hard. So we are more known about the playing part, but they are at the same time. So the thinking behind is, if I can do my work at the beach with my computer, why not? So it might be more pleasurable. Creativity, so Brazilians like to think about themselves as creative people, and this creativity is very well known in the flexibility, which we call the jeitinho brasileiro, the little way that Brazilians use to solve problems with very little resources. Yeah. So how COVID is doing there? Not well.
Yeah, initially, Brazilians looked up to a savior, and the savior can be a god, or it can be the president, or it can be the governor of the state, or the mayor of the city. But people typically in the hierarchical culture of Brazil, they look upwards for someone to save them. And the people who are at the top of the hierarchy feel that it is their duty to save the people, so they have difficulty in delegating. So initially, there developed a politicization of the process, because the president wanted to say that he was in charge, but at the same time, he's not in charge of the administering the states and the local cities. That's for the mayors. But they got into a fight about what was necessary to be done. The president wanted to have national measures, and the governors were pushing back. So quickly it became a discussion about politics, and the virus became secondary. So whoever was supporting the president was supporting everything that he said about the virus, and whoever was opposing the president was criticizing everything that he said about the virus. And it wasn't about the virus anymore, it was just politics. Fortunately, there was a lot of community initiatives locally. And while the politicians were fighting it out, communities took the initiative to help each other, to distribute food for the needy. In the slums in Rio, the favelas, even the drug lords who run the show in those favelas, they decided that there should be certain measures put in place.
Even a curfew.
Even a curfew, which was never implemented anywhere else. But in those communities, there was a curfew, and there were people from the drug gangs policing the streets so that people would not be out in the streets at night. They were also requiring people to maintain social distance and to wear masks, and all this was done by the community itself. On the other hand, because of the magical thinking, there was a lot of people discussing that we need to think positively. So if we think positively, the virus will go away. And in practice, that meant that a lot of people simply denied that the virus was really such a serious threat. They said, well, it can't be. This is a political issue. People are saying that the virus is dangerous just because they are opposing what the president was saying. The president was trying to calm people down by saying it's really nothing so serious. Most of the people will just have a little flu, and that's all. But then, of course, he was criticized for saying that. And his whole stance has been to play it down, to feed upon this positive thinking. Yeah.
Which again, it's not a problem to have the positive thinking, but it's necessary more than that. And the country was divided, and many people don't really follow the lockdown. Yeah, we saw that maybe when it was the top number, it was 60% of the population in the lockdown, and now it's around 40% people who are doing.
So in practice in Brazil, people, one, because it's a collectivistic culture as well, it was very hard for people to stay isolated at home for a long time. Yeah. We got 60% of the population doing that, but only for about a month. And then it went down, and now it's around 40% who are still isolated. Everybody else is going out on the streets, and that's why we have such a high toll of cases and deaths in Brazil. Also, a lot of people betting on miracle cures, simply saying that, okay, if we have hydroxychloroquine, that will save us. So even now, when Bolsonaro was tested positive, he said, don't worry, I'm okay. I'm taking hydroxychloroquine, so it won't be serious.
Well, we are going further. And now an example of a network cluster. So this is Netherlands. Netherlands then has a low hierarchy, and people treasure their autonomy, and people really tend not like to be told what to do. So they treasure their individual opinions. And when there is a need for discussions, a certain issue, everybody must be present, must be there, and must be heard. And from there, the discussion can take to consensus. Consensus in the Netherlands also helps, can take longer to get the consensus, but when people get there, so there's a lot of engagement, so which really facilitates the implementation. Yeah. Because it's a low hierarchy, there's equivalence. So it's a bit more than being equal. It's recognizing sometimes that people are different, but they all have the same rights. And another characteristic of the culture is the quality of life. So let's say that the work is important, but the ambition goes until certain point. If that ambition or that new job that is being offered to me will affect my quality of life, I will probably tend to choose for the quality of life.
Yeah, it's a different kind of ambition.
Yeah, different kind of ambition.
It's ambition for quality of life, and not for
job or money or yeah. It's really well said. Thank you.
So what happened when the virus arrived in the Netherlands is that initially, of course, there was a big discussion in society overall and in Parliament, and there was a certain delay in adopting a strategy. And the first strategy that was adopted was to let everybody get the virus. Let's just isolate the people who are more fragile, because there's a concern for quality of life and caring for people. So the elderly should be isolated. People that have pre-existing health conditions should be isolated. But otherwise, let's just let everybody catch the virus so that we would have the so-called herd immunity. However, a week after that was announced, the projections of the Imperial College came out, and they revealed that if nothing else was done, the number of deaths might be quite big, and that was then unacceptable. However, changing the strategy required another week of discussions until eventually the Parliament decided that there should be recommendations for social isolation, and there should be a lockdown that would be implemented gradually in the coming weeks and not immediately. The concern that the government had was not to impose anything, because they knew that if they tried to impose something, people would rebel against it. Yeah? And indeed, even with the mere recommendations, a lot of people disobeyed them. There was a lot of disobedience because indeed the Dutch don't like to be told what to do. So what happened in practice is that people decided individually to stay at home or to not stay at home, to work from home or to go to the office. It was mostly an individual decision to follow the recommendation of the government or not to follow them. The only thing that indeed was decreed and demanded from government was to close the schools and to isolate the elderly. And that worked well. Now, the concern that the government had about not imposing anything caused them to decentralize the execution. So when they announced the recommendations, they also said it's up to the municipalities to enforce those measures. It's up to the municipalities to decide whether they would apply fines or not to people who disobeyed the recommendations, whether the police would be going out and checking whether people were complying with the social distancing, for instance. Yeah. And there was no demand, for instance, to wear masks at the time. Only months later, they decided that masks would be required in public transportation, but that's all. So what we see today is that nobody wears masks in the Netherlands because people feel that this is something that is hindering their own individual expression, perhaps. Yeah.
You're
So,
not sure about what is working for this.
Yeah. But
the
fact
distance,
is that
the social distance is very well practiced. And this is also, let's say, part of the culture, because in a culture like Brazil, touching and being together and kissing so often happen. Here, there's some more distance that people normally keep. So if you see the picture there, this is not from the time of COVID.
This was taken
before.
This
so
was
people
taken
are
in October.
Isolated groups
And
already.
you see that people are already isolating themselves from
in
each other.
Small groups.
But that's normal. So isolation, social distancing in the Netherlands is easier to implement and to enforce because it's natural. It's much more difficult in collectivistic cultures. There was also voluntary closing of shops, but basically there were some shops who decided that they were going to stay open, and they remained open throughout the whole period, although they were less than 10% of the shops. 90% of the shops decided to close. And when they decided to open again, each shop decided when to open, because there was no formal demand for the shops to close. Now, going to Germany, that's a different story.
Yeah, Germany is part of the cluster of the well-oiled machine, so low hierarchy, and at the same time a need for order and a structure. So people feel empowered to do their tasks independently as far as the ambiguity is put aside. So that's why also the structure, the planning, the procedure are very much of value.
Yeah, to avoid uncertainty.
To avoid uncertainty and to have a clear way of doing things. Discipline is coming together. We will see how much this helps in the case of Germany. And in this context, expertise, it's very much of value. So what a scientist is saying, sometimes it's more important than what the boss is saying, and can take a priority in a decision, for example. So this, in COVID, made a lot of difference.
Yeah, because the first thing, of course, in Germany was listen to the experts. And it helped that Angela Merkel herself has a scientific background. So even before the first cases were identified in Germany, the experts got together and started planning, what are we going to do when the virus gets here, because it will eventually get here. And they started immediately making test kits so that they could do mass testing. and preparing a strategy for when the virus would arrive. There was organized action, there was early planning and action, and the execution was practically flawless because, again, the Dutch culture is very disciplined. So people knew that once the experts gave them instructions, the German culture is very...
Here it's the opposite.
The German culture is very disciplined. So they knew that once the instructions were laid out by the experts, everybody should follow them and then it would work. There was also a pre-existing healthcare structure of very good quality in Germany. So they had and do have great hospitals and an extensive network of hospitals. So this was put in to serve the COVID strategy. And this explains why Germany actually has one of the best indicators in terms of deaths per million people in Europe, because there was already this healthcare structure in place to avoid uncertainty.
Which is also true in Austria, although Austria had a lot of problems at the beginning, but the healthcare structure helped.
Very much so.
So going to the US also has a low hierarchy in the country, and then autonomy is very much treasured there, as well as the freedom. So the freedom to do things that I believe in, and the confrontation and competition. So there's this basic assumption that if the confrontation comes, something good will come up from this. And it's necessary that that to be a fair play. So the rules of the game should be clear for people to compete. And in the competition, we will have normally the winners and the losers, and this polarization is very often everything to the winner, nothing to the loser, until the loser recover him or herself and start competing again. In these cultures or type of cultures, performance and a standout are of value, and results, especially the short-term results, because it's also a culture more focusing the short term, and there's a bias for action. So in general, people start with the action, start with the practice to go to the theory. And this action must be really short term. That's the best action that can be done.
So initially, the Americans, of course, had a lot of self-confidence and felt that, well, maybe the virus will not ever get here because it's on the other corner of the world in China. If it gets here, we will know how to deal with it. But once the virus got there, there was quick action, but uncoordinated action, because people, again, in the US don't like to be told what to do. They fight back against any kind of a measure that is imposed from government. And there was immediately a conflict, and again, polarization between the president and the Republicans and the Democrats as governors or mayors on the other end. So whatever President Trump said was criticized by the Democrats, and whatever the Democrats said was criticized by Trump and by the Republicans. And there was a lot of finger pointing that whatever was going wrong because there was a Democrat behind it or because there was a Republican behind it. So in the meantime, the virus continued to spread because the virus doesn't care about politics, and it continued to spread from person to person. But the main issue with America is indeed that people also have a higher risk appetite. So they're willing to take the risk and they reject any kind of imposition. So they're basically saying, okay, I'll take my chances. I'll go out. I'm responsible for my own actions, and I'll go out and see what happens. And what has happened is that we have over 130,000 deaths and millions of cases.
And a new wave.
Yeah.
A new wave.
Because again, people wanted to leave to exercise their freedom. They didn't want to stay home because they wanted to exercise their freedom to go about. And that is creating a second wave. They're paying a price for this love of freedom. So we're
Questions.
now going to take your questions.
Questions.
We already have a couple of them here.
Yeah.
I'm going to put the
That is good.
the scheme already again up here, just as a reminder.
Yeah.
The contest, the well-oiled machine, the network, pyramid, solar system, and family.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to stop sharing our screen and start addressing the questions. So if you have questions, please type them now in the chat box, and we will address them.
I saw that Chantal already sent the question. Does the central government in Beijing hide the truth to the rest of the world? Well, Chantal, I prefer to think that not, because I think that maybe what happened is what happened like in Wuhan, that there was the idea that this is not so important, this is not so serious, that this we will deal here and that's it. So maybe they play it down, but
well,
we never know.
Well, there was, let's say, some attempt to play it down for about a week in January. But as early as January the 20th or 21st, the World Health Organization was informed that the threat was serious and that it would spread. Yeah? But for those first couple of weeks in January, they thought that they could contain it. And again, it was a little bit about trying to hide the bad news. It's not going to be as bad as people are saying. But quickly they realized that, oops, it is really serious, and they had to formally inform everybody else.
Yeah, there's a question that is related to that. Are not the Chinese avoiding telling the outsiders about the problem because it can cause loss of faith and erosion of their power position? Yes, I think so. But then I'm not sure if it's really hiding or if it was playing down because thinking that it's not so serious. But then when it was serious, it was the lockdown. I can think that also at the beginning, UK played down, Sweden played down, and thought that, okay, we can go maybe with this called
herd immunity.
And then realizing, well, that's not the case. We have to do something else. So maybe it's that. I prefer to think that it's maybe that. Huh? And the same TJ who gave this question also said about, and then now he has COVID. Serves him Bolsonaro, right? Well, in one side, it might serve well the country if he really takes this seriously and think that, well, everybody can have it. But it might not serve well even him, but especially the country, if he recover easily and think that how I said before, because he said before, it's not so serious. No, it's a little cold, flu, a little flu that people can recover. So let's see how he will deal with this. I hope that this can help him to see the seriousness of the problem.
Mathieu Grenier has asked, where would you put Canada in your chart? Canada is also a contest culture. Yeah? Although there are differences, of course, between the culture in Canada and also in New Zealand and the UK and the US, but they are all contest cultures because they share similar scores in the Hofstede model.
And they share some basic values that are expressed differently. Canada dealt very well, so the results are being very, very good there.
Yeah. George has asked the question about Sweden. Can you try to explain Sweden? Yeah, we can, and we will include Sweden in another
another presentation.
But
maybe you can say something.
Yeah, very quickly, we can say that Sweden is very similar to the Netherlands in terms of the culture and in terms of the strategy they adopted.
Because it's part of the network.
Yeah, it's also a network culture, of course. But what happened in Sweden is that the recommendations of the government were even lighter than in the Netherlands. In Sweden, there was no lockdown. They basically said restaurants can remain open as long as you maintain social distancing. Yeah. But in practice, a lot of people still disobeyed the recommendation. And the big problem they had were with the elderly homes, because they recommended, again, that the elderly be isolated, and in practice, they weren't. Visitors continued to arrive without knowing they spread the virus. There was lack of equipment for nurses in the elderly homes, and they spread the virus as well, the nurses, without knowing. Yeah. And they had a huge amount of deaths because of that. Yeah. But we can go in the next webinar, we'll talk more about Sweden.
Yeah. Now, Heli is asking, how would you say culture should be taken into account when designing a solution or an approach to address the problem? Well, we hope that people will learn, one country will learn from the other ones and take what is more or less possible to adapt to their own culture. For instance, testing was very effective, using masks were very effective, lockdown, the social distancing, the tracking of people who were infected, tracking the contact, effective. So there are some solutions that are not difficult to take. For instance, countries that are very much focused in group relations. It's easy to use the groups to connect and know who was infected and to track the other ones. So for instance, then there are solutions that I think can be learned from one another.
Yeah, and also I think it's important that the government realizes what kind of culture they have so that they can adopt measures, and especially in the communication of those measures. This is something that the Netherlands realized because the Prime Minister came up with the idea of an intelligent lockdown. So it was a way of telling people, if you follow the recommendations, you are not being submissive, but you're being intelligent. And this is more appealing in the Dutch culture than if he said, hey guys, you all have to do this. If he put it that way, then the result would be the opposite.
Yeah.
So it's important that the government realize what are the aspects of the local culture that need to be taken into account in the way they communicate
to help
the measures.
Yeah, in India, for instance, Modi came to to people to talk and used the paternalistic approach. Yeah, so it was lockdown, mandatory, but and from one day to another, but he came and said, I need your help. I need you to think, and he appeals to the family.
Yeah, he was like a benevolent father.
Benevolent father. Yeah. You help, you must think about your family, you must help, and please, this information, because they have a lot of information about COVID and how it was going on, and so please spread this information among other people of your groups. So
yeah, it's interesting.
It was also using
because we had a family culture in India who took a different approach in terms of being a benevolent father, but he used that to the advantage of the process. And in Portugal was also a pyramid, social pyramid culture. The results were quite good because there was no political infighting within Portugal. So the results were much better in Portugal compared to Brazil, because again, the leaders acted differently and in a way that was more consistent with the local culture.
Yeah, they appeal for the civic feeling in Portugal, and also they give a good example. So the prime minister went to a beach when was a bit starting to stop the lockdown, but when there with a mask, wearing a mask, very short. Went to the beach and then came back and said and keep the distance from other people and talking about this. So this was also using.
There's another comment from TJ saying that the Chinese don't think it is hiding information. They are protecting their citizens. The same reason for what is happening in Hong Kong now. Yeah, indeed, that you're absolutely right. They don't see it as hiding information. They see it as protecting the citizens. But the funny thing is, the Chinese people themselves also believe in that.
Yeah, not everybody, of course, but some people.
Well, a lot of them, the majority.
Yeah, the
majority believe that they are being protected by their government.
Yeah.
The problem is that when we look at it from an egalitarian perspective, we see autocracy and oppression.
Yeah, we only see that.
But when you ask the Chinese themselves, and we have several friends in China,
feel safe.
And they think that, well, our government is doing great.
Yeah.
And they feel safe.
Yeah. There's also now in China, I think it's not so recent, but they start with an app with colors, green, orange or yellow and red for people. So people in their phones, they fill up a form and they have a color. And if the color is green, they can go everywhere with masks, of course. If it's red, you should not go out. And they can be blocked if they are red and try to enter in a station or so. So the majority of people, as far as we saw in some articles, are feeling safe with this, are feeling that this is a good way to protect the whole community. So it's a different perspective.
But if you try to implement something like that in the US or in the Netherlands, it will be impossible.
No way. Yeah.
The Netherlands did not approve having a tracking app to begin with. While in China, they think that they're being protected. Now, there's another comment or question from George. Can you see the similarity in Bolsonaro's approach and Trump's approach, playing it down? Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The thing is, Trump, of course, wants to play down the virus because he doesn't want a recession, because it would damage his chances of getting reelected. So he's basically saying, don't worry, it's not a problem. Bolsonaro has a similar situation, although his next election is still 2.5 years away, but his popularity depends on people continuing to feel happy. So if the economy tanks, he will be even more unpopular. So he was also trying to play it down to say, hey, there's nothing to see here, everything is okay. Yeah. So they both had very similar attitudes, playing down the virus.
There's a question.
There was even a joke today about Bolsonaro in Brazil because he caught the virus now, and they said, oh, he tested positive, and it's like a pregnancy test.
Yes.
Yeah, and the father is Trump, because Bolsonaro is imitating Trump in many of these populistic measures.
Yeah. There's a question from Viviane.
Yeah.
How do you explain the difference between New Zealand and the US? It's only leadership? Certainly not, because it's a very complex issue, and leadership. But leadership play a role, of course, because the way that Trump is in US dealing with the problem, it's similar to Brazil, and they have the worst results. So New Zealand has a different approach, a different way, a different leadership, and its results are very, very good.
Yeah, although the New Zealand culture is also a contest culture, it has nuances of being a bit more caring than the Americans. Like also the Canadians are also a contest culture,
but
But
also
there are
more caring.
big differences with the US,
Yeah.
in terms of being more caring.
Yeah. Okay, there was a question about are we going to learn with our mistakes, or are we going to do the same in 5 years from now? I think it's
here. Do we learn from our mistakes? If it happens again in 5 years, will the countries have a different reaction?
That's from Hanalu.
Yeah, they will learn something, maybe not as much as we would like them to learn, but countries are learning from what is happening now. For instance, we followed this process a little bit. The Chinese had a big problem in Wuhan because they really did not know how to handle the virus. And the rest of the world learned a lot from the way the Chinese were handling it. Not in terms of the lockdown, but for instance, they learned from the Chinese the importance of the personal protective equipment. Because initially, the Chinese were wearing all that equipment and they were still getting contaminated, the doctors and nurses, because they had to learn a special way of changing the clothing and the masks without contaminating their hands. And they created a new protocol where they have a special way of disrobing and dressing and cleaning their hands between the process. And this is now being followed all over the world. But people learned from what happened in China. Also, we can say that Europe learned from what happened in Italy, because they began taking things more seriously when they saw the tragedy that was going on in Italy. And that also helped other countries to take it more seriously. Can you explain Norway, Denmark, and Finland?
Wow, we need a new we need a new presentation.
Well, indeed, what happened is that in these countries there was a consensus that the lockdown was necessary. So the caring aspect of the cultures in Norway, Denmark, and Finland was actually more important in these cultures than the love of freedom and the autonomy and independence. In Sweden and the Netherlands, the number of deaths per million was quite higher than in Denmark, Finland, and Norway. And I think the difference was that the caring aspect was actually more important, stronger in these countries, although they all belong to the same network culture.
But they are different.
But in practice, there is a little bit of difference, and this difference made a big difference.
This applied to the question from Hanalu. New Zealand has beaten Corona, Canada didn't, but they belong to the same group. Yes, but they are different. So that's what we said at the beginning. There's some basic values, some similarities that from a statistic work from Hofstede bring those countries close to each other. But it's very complex. We are talking about very complex cultures. So there's lots of not the same.
They're similar, but they're not the same.
And there are different aspects in each culture that must be considered for the results, the final result.
To clarify, the USA probably has least amount of shared culture, probably contributing to fragmented response. Indeed, this is an aspect, the Americans often refer to themselves as a melting pot, and I have always contested that they're more of a mosaic rather than a melting pot, because there are a lot of ghetto cultures within the States. It doesn't really melt. So you do have fragmented responses also because of that.
Somebody is asking, how about Russia? Maybe for another time. Yes, it's also for another time, but it's a pyramid culture.
It's also a pyramid culture.
A pyramid culture. Yeah. So it's again the top-down decisions, the way that Putin is placing the lockdown also, but they are not with good results.
Yeah. Although scientists across the world are used to cooperate, how do you think culture will impact their search to find and sell a vaccine? Well, it's interesting that scientists all over the world are only recently, only since SARS, did they really begin to cooperate fully.
Yeah.
Up until then, there were a lot of cultural barriers to cooperation, and now they are indeed increasing their cooperation. But the culture does play a role, for instance, in finding and selling a vaccine. Uh, the Americans, for instance, were quick to announce that they were buying millions of vaccines even before they were having them on the market, but they already have contracts. So they were quick to take a decision and secure that the American people will have access to the vaccine. Yeah. And of course, other countries criticize that because they say, well, you're cornering the market. Yeah. You should do this in a way that is coordinated with all the other countries so that we don't exclude anybody because they don't have the money, the clout to secure that. So there will be some clashes because of cultural differences.
Yeah, but also now there are some around 120 countries searching for a vaccine. How much those countries are really cooperating, we don't know. We don't have this information. But maybe in a good tone of information that we can give now is that India starts testing vaccine in animals last month, and it was successful. And they started this month testing in humans, and they are announcing that probably 15 August, right? They might have in India, they might have the vaccine. So
yeah,
but how much the cooperation is going on, I hope people can, the scientists also can learn how to do that.
Yeah, the Indian government is saying on Independence Day, August 15, we will have a vaccine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
So that's a bold statement.
Yeah.
And we're not sure
if they have it. Good
they
for
will
the
have
world.
it. But it's typical, again, of the Indian family culture that the ruler in the role of benevolent father says, don't worry, we will have something that will save the country, and it's only a month away from now. I hope that it actually does happen.
And Chantal is talking about the presentation. Well, we are recording this and will be available at YouTube. And I'd like to go to a question that was before about if we are learning with our mistakes. So it was from Honolulu. Yeah. Okay. So if we are learning from our mistakes, so we hope so, Honolulu. Yeah.
I think we're over our time, Jo.
Yeah.
And we've addressed all the questions that came up to this moment.
Okay. So let's show
what happens next.
Yeah, from our side.
We will have other webinars coming soon to your screen. And they won't be always about culture and not always about the coronavirus. We want to address issues like the competencies of successful entrepreneurs. What is the result of a research that the UN carried out in 18 different cultures and found what are the 10 competencies that account for success within entrepreneurs. Also about leadership and virtual leadership. There's an extensive list of webinars that we will hold. Some of them will be free, like this one. Others will be more like courses and that you will have to pay for admission, but we do intend to keep the cost down because we want to basically share
more
the knowledge that we have with more people around the world. And one of them will be specifically about the 6 styles of culture, the Wursten framework in more detail, so we can go deeper and explain it.
Yeah, and also we hope to have help Thurston himself also in this one.
Yeah, we want
Yeah.
to
have
interview
him also,
Haub live on
Yeah.
a webinar as well.
telling a bit his model.
If you're interested in reading more about this, we have a series of books that we have written at the top of the screen. And we have Haub's book called the 7 Mental Images of National Culture, because in addition to the 6 that we have shared with you today, Haub considers Japan a separate style of culture.
Yeah.
So you can find all these books on Amazon.com. If you have other questions, you can send them to us using our website and our email addresses.
Yeah, we will be pleased to answer directly any questions that you have from now or later on. Okay.
So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you for
very nice seeing you.
Attending. Yeah.